I remember being in a courtroom much like this one in North Carolina a few years ago, covering one of the most fascinating cases in modern history in the United States. It was a murder trial of Dr. Jeffrey McDonald. He was a Green Beret, and he was also an emergency room physician. And his family was murdered one night, his wife and his 2 young children. And I remember having lunch with Jeffrey McDonald while the jury was deliberating his fate. And I remember him being very at ease and very casual. And finally I said, "Aren't you worried that they might find you guilty? Aren't you worried that they might convict you of this crime?" And he sort of waved his half-eaten sandwich in the general direction of the jury room, and he said, "Oh, them? Nah, they'll never find me guilty." And then I think it sounded kind of cynical, and then he said, "You know, I'm innocent, you know." Well, he wasn't innocent. And you know who proved that he was guilty of murdering his family? It was the scientists. Not just the detectives. It was those who were able to apply scientific knowledge to the evidence and help the jury come to the conclusion that Jeffrey McDonald was lying when he said some drug-crazed hippies had come in and stabbed him and knocked him unconscious and murdered his family. And the way scientists were able to do that was by examining the blood evidence. It's called serology. And they found that the 3 victims in that murder case each had a different blood type. And so when Jeffrey McDonald told his story of what happened, they were able to look at the different blood patterns and to show it didn't fit his story. Then they were able to do microscopic analysis of little threads from the pajamas that he had worn that night and which he claimed had been ripped by the intruders. And when they studied the microscopic analysis of these threads, they were able to show that his story didn't hold water. And then finally, there were holes in those pajamas that he claimed were caused by an ice pick that was wielded by these drug-crazed hippies. And yet the scientists, by studying under a microscope the shape of those holes, they were able to establish that Jeffrey McDonald's story was fabricated. The jury found him guilty and sent him away for the rest of his life in prison. I remember the day they carted him off in handcuffs, last day I'd ever seen him. It just goes to show the power of scientific evidence in a court of law. Well, what about the case for Christ? Is there any scientific evidence that can help us establish whether Jesus Christ really is who he claimed to be? Well, in the case of the New Testament, the kind of science we look at is the science of archaeology, the study of ancient coins, of ancient inscriptions, of ancient documents, and things like that. Now, there's some limits in terms of what archaeology can do. Let me give you an analogy. Let's say that you're accused of a crime that occurred in Toronto. And you said, "Hey, wait a minute, I didn't do that. At the time that crime was committed, I was in Montreal, and I was at a movie theater, and I was watching a particular movie on a particular day at a particular time, and the movie theater that day was totally full with people, and I was eating a certain kind of a candy bar." Now, detectives can go back, and they can investigate that. Does that movie theater exist? Was it showing that movie on that day? Was the movie theater, according to the theater's records, full that day or not? Was that kind of candy available at that time and on that date? Now, if all of that information contradicts what you said, your credibility has been shot, and you're in deep trouble. But if they go back and they confirm all that you said, that doesn't mean your entire story necessarily is true. It just means that so far, the things that we can check out have checked out. And so far, your credibility has withstood the test of investigation. So you can see that archaeology can't prove everything about Jesus. It can't prove to us that the Bible is the Word of God. But it can give us some indication as to whether the writers of the New Testament and the biographies of Jesus were careful in what they recorded. Because if archaeology can check out certain things and they check out to be accurate, that's some indication that these writers were accurate about perhaps the other things that they wrote about Jesus as well. Now, some people used to claim that, well, you can't trust what these writers said about Jesus because it's full of errors. And the example they would point to would be concerning the Gospel of Luke. Now, Luke wrote about 25% of the entire New Testament, the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. So he's a very important writer. And he claimed to have been very careful in checking everything out. And archaeologists used to say, he doesn't know what he's talking about. Because right there in Luke chapter 3, verse 1, Luke makes a reference to Licinius, who Luke says is a tetrarch or a ruler of an area that was called Abilene at that time, about 27 AD. And the archaeologists would say that just shows Luke doesn't know what he's talking about, because everybody knows that Licinius was not a tetrarch in 27 AD in Abilene. He was a king, and he was put to death 50 years earlier. So look, if Luke can't get these basic facts right, then we can't trust anything he says. And yet, a few years ago, 14 miles northwest of Damascus, in an area where in the first century it had been called Abilene, they found a monument to Licinius, the tetrarch of Abilene, who'd been the tetrarch right in the same time frame that Luke said he was. It turned out there were two Liciniuses, and Luke was right after all. A similar thing happened when Luke recorded in Acts 17. He made a reference to what he called the politarchs, or magistrates, in the city of Thessalonica. Now, everybody said, politarchs, there's no such title. Luke is wrong. Luke doesn't know what he's talking about. And that was the rap that Luke had for a number of years from archaeologists, until they began to find inscriptions to politarchs. In fact, they found over 30, in fact 35 of these inscriptions, several of them referring to that very city that Luke had mentioned in the same time frame that Luke had written about. And so what do we have? Another example where Luke was right, and it turns out that the archaeologists had been mistaken. New evidence had shown that Luke was accurate in what he wrote. You look at John. For many years, people would look at John's reference to the Pool of Bethesda and the 5 porticos that this supposedly had. People said, there's no evidence of that. Where's John get that information? He doesn't know what he's talking about. Until a few years ago, they excavated the Pool of Bethesda, and it had 5 porticos, just as John said that it did. They've also found other archaeological locations based on the writings of John, and they've shown that John was correct in what he'd written in those references. Well, what does this mean? It means basically this. If Luke, for instance, was so meticulous in all these references that he wrote to get all of the details right, all the things that we can check out that he was meticulously careful about what he recorded. If that is true, then why would we not think that Luke would be any less careful in reporting the really important things like the resurrection of Jesus Christ, upon which all of Christianity hinges? If he's going to be that careful in minute details, pretty good chance he's going to be equally careful in things of monumental importance. Now, archaeology can't establish for us the truth necessarily of the New Testament. But when the things that we can check out do check out, that's important. Not too many years ago, there was an atheist who wrote an article, and it said, well, the New Testament makes a reference to Nazareth being around in the 1st century. And he said, there's no evidence of that. He said, there is no evidence that Nazareth existed during that time frame. And yet, a few years ago, sure enough, what they found is some records from the ancient world. After the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, they had to send out the priests and their families to new locations from Jerusalem. And the records show that some families were sent to Nazareth, right there in the 1st century, just as the New Testament had recorded. Now, what does all this mean? I think it means that we can have some confidence in what the New Testament tells us, because it's corroborated time and again by archaeology. And this is not true of every other religion. When I was doing my investigation as an atheist into Christianity, I investigated other world religions too. I looked, for instance, at Mormonism. I wanted to know. The Book of Mormon makes all kinds of claims about things that supposedly happened a long time ago in the Americas. Was that substantiated by archaeology? Well, I wrote a letter to the National Museum of Natural History, the Smithsonian Institute in the United States, and I asked them that question. I said, Book of Mormon makes these claims about things that supposedly happened. Is there a connection between that and what archaeology tells us? And they wrote me back a letter and said, quote, "There is no direct connection between the archaeology of the New World and the subject matter of the Book of Mormon." In fact, there was a book written by John Ankerberg and John Weldon, who each hold doctorates, concerning Mormonism. And this is what they said. "No Book of Mormon cities have ever been located. No Book of Mormon person, place, nation, or names has ever been found. No Book of Mormon artifacts. No Book of Mormon scriptures. No Book of Mormon inscriptions. Nothing which demonstrates the Book of Mormon is anything other than myth or invention has ever been found." Now that's a good example of archaeology casting doubt upon an historical record. In contrast, archaeology supports Luke and John and Mark as they write about the life, the teachings, the miracles, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The things that can be checked out can be and are checked out by archaeology. And that gives us increased confidence that when we read these ancient historical documents that make up the New Testament of the Bible, we can have some confidence that they're reporting what actually took place. We're going to call a recess now in the Case for Christ. I hope you'll join me next time when we pick up here and resume looking at the evidence for Jesus Christ.